And I think this, the Sunset District, uh, uh, it's a really interesting neighborhood. And actually, how many of you live here in the Sunset? So yeah, yeah, and yeah, and but it developed, mostly back in the 30s and 40s, I think, is when most of the housing was built here in our commercial quarters initially, and it was kind of the suburbs in San Francisco. It was built, along the streetcar lines, the L and the N, and there were other streetcar lines as well, and it was really like from the very beginning, a very much of a working class neighborhood, home opportunity for home ownership for, working class people, and it's even different than the Richmond district or, the fancier neighborhoods like St. Francis Wood, obviously, and Forest Hill, which were more like for higher income, but the Sunset has always had a strong working class character to it from the very beginning, and so I think that's really shaped the neighborhood. And also the businesses here, have always been sort of catering to the working class families, that have been here. And originally, it was more the Irish and Italian sort of working class European families that moved out here, and it developed around that. And then, but it was, I think, now, so obviously the Sunset is very much Asian American and Chinese American. I think that really started with well, actually, it's even connected to the Asian movement and the history of Asian Americans in this country, right? With the ending of the exclusionary immigration laws that finally happened in the 1960s, and that allowed, more family-based immigration to start, into the U.S. and an end to the racially exclusionary immigration policies that were in place for 100 years pretty much. And so we saw that in San Francisco overall, but particularly in the Sunset and the Richmond and other neighborhoods starting in the 1970s, and especially increasing in the 80s, 90s, and 2000, this really surge in Chinese immigrant, Asian immigrant families to San Francisco, and particularly here in the Sunset, where we went from pretty much, I think in the 1970s, there was a very low population of Chinese or Asians here. I don't know if you guys know that, you SF State folks, but it was pretty low, right? And I mean, the Chinese are really limited to Chinatown and a few other neighborhoods, and Japanese in Japantown, but the Sunset went, from pretty close to zero to now we've been a majority Asian American district, for over 10 years, and so the Chinese community and the Asian community is very much now really a big part of the identity of the Sunset District, and I think that's been really positive for the neighborhood. I know over the decades there was some racial tension around that, and I wasn't here at the time, but I definitely am aware of it, like the changeover from mostly working class white neighborhood to now a majority working class Asian American neighborhood. There were racial tensions and challenges with that, but by now I think the Sunset's just an amazing place, I think, with such a strong Asian American identity, but also still a lot of diversity here too, and it's a great neighborhood. Katie, you mentioned that the Chinese community or the Sunsets has a history of being progressive, and I think you mentioned Wamei School being an example. Like my daughter Leanne went to Wamei as well, and Wamei was the first, and Ben Wong here is the executive director of Wamei School. But yeah, Wamei was really historic. It was the first bilingual preschool in the city, is that right?
That is correct.
And that was 50 years ago, is that?
1974, we'll be celebrating 50 years in about a year and a half.
Yeah. And it was really created by the community, as part of the civil rights and the community empowerment movement, right? And it's still going strong now.
it's still going strong now.
Yeah. So that's an example, I think, of a progressive, groundbreaking work here in the Sunset coming out of the Asian community. And I think there are other examples as well. You mentioned Alice Fong Yu and sort of the school district's sort of Chinese immersion and language immersion programs. A lot of that did come from the families in the Sunset and on the West Side wanting their kids to be able to have a deeper connection to their culture and not just language. So my daughter Leanne went to Chinese immersion at West Portal and Hoover, which is another example of that. That I think came out. Oh no, actually West Portal was the first Chinese immersion program, and then Alice Fong Yu was an entire school. So I think on education issues, or these are good examples of the community being sort of progressive, and maybe there are others. But I think there's also, it's kind of a mixed, like if you look at our community here in the Sunset, it's kind of a mixed bag, right? And there's other examples where the Chinese community has been more fairly conservative and sort of not necessarily fully supportive, and sometimes in opposition to efforts around racial justice and social justice, particularly for other people. So, and I think the Chinese community, a lot of it is because there's a strong focus on our community and wanting, and because of the history of racism and discrimination, for so long, there's and then for new immigrant families that are coming here too, there's other dynamics. So there's a strong sense of like protecting our community and wanting to ensure that our families in our community, our interests are protected, right? So, but sometimes that could be in conflict with other interests and even like progressive, social justice agendas. So yeah, and in fact, the Sunset District, before I was elected supervisor 4 years ago, was kind of known as more of a conservative, one of the more conservative districts, or in some cases, the most conservative district in the city. And we had elected supervisors here since we went back to district elections of supervisors in 2000 that were always sort of moderate or conservative Chinese supervisors. But my election 4 years ago was the first time. Well, actually, we had Chinese supervisors every election going back to 2000. That just kind of reflects the demographics of the neighborhood. But when I was elected 4 years ago, I was the first Chinese supervisor that was more progressive and coming from a progressive sort of community and labor background. So that was a change. And so yeah. And maybe just to finish up, and then would love to, have the discussion with you guys. In my first term, it's been challenging. So it's been a great honor, and I to representing this neighborhood that I love so much, and raising my family here, and feel so really privileged to be able to have been able to raise my family here and now represent on the Board of Supervisors. It has been challenging with some of the political and the racial dynamics, and like some of the issues as a progressive here representing the Sunset District. I've been, for example, been a big champion of building more affordable housing in the Sunsets, because historically, as I mentioned, or you all know, this is a working class community. It has always been that way. And that's been what's so wonderful about the Sunset, that's part of our character, whether it's the Irish or the Italian immigrants or the Chinese families and other families that have made Sunset their home over the last decades. But that's really changed a lot now with the huge, crazy surge in housing costs, where now the median price to buy a house in the Sunset is like $1.5 to $2 million, and to rent a decent, 2-bedroom apartment is, really like $3,500. So it's no longer affordable to working class or even middle class folks. And so as supervisor, I've been a big champion of expanding affordable housing, and I'm really proud that we've had, in my first term, historic investments in affordable housing here in the Sunset. We broke ground on the city's first ever affordable housing project for teachers, and for SF Unified, teachers and other school workers out on 43rd and Judah last month. And that'll be 135 new homes for school, for teachers and paraprofessionals and other school workers in our city. And then I've also been a big champion of our first ever affordable housing development for low-income families. That's at 2550 Irving. And that's been a pretty contentious issue. I don't know if you've been following that when that was first announced in like a year and a half ago. And like there was strong opposition in the neighborhood to it. I mean, some of it was about the height, you know, because it's going to be 7 stories over on Irving and 26th Avenue, which is it's a bit high for that. Although there's a building across the street that's been there for like 80 years that is 6 or 7 stories. But I think the stronger reaction in opposition to it was because it's for low-income families. It also includes some of the units for formerly homeless families as well, permanent supportive housing. So a lot of the opposition to it was kind of from a class and a racial, racially exclusionary perspective, and not wanting to see lower income and people and honestly, like a lot of the most extreme opposition was not to see Black people be able to live in the Sunset District. I mean, that came out in some of the most extreme community meetings and comments that I was in. But I think that kind of reflects, again, the Sunset's sort of mixed, it's kind of a mixed bag politically. And a lot of the working class families here, Chinese and white, they are very conservative, and they had a very strong negative reaction to build, particularly to this proposed affordable housing development for low-income families. So, but I think we stood strong on that, and the project got its approval. I supported the city funding for it for the purchase of the site and the initial pre-development, and now they're going to move ahead with starting construction on that in the coming months. And I think the community is going to, and yeah, Ben, I mean, Wame is kind of near there, and you were involved in that as well. Once it's built, and people have also, it brought out really racist and reactionary sentiments about public housing, because they're saying, oh, this is going to be Valencia. I mean, anyway, they were saying it's going to be the public housing project in slums in the Sunset. And some of the most reactionary comments were, that it's going to bring in drug dealers, drug addicts, and crime. But I think once it's built, it's going to be done by 2024. People will see that, it's going to be a really positive addition for the neighborhood. It's going to allow, actually, a lot of folks that had made working class families who had traditionally made the Sunset District what it is, be able to actually live here now because they can't afford the price of the house or even an apartment. So, so I'm just trying to, okay, so maybe to wrap it up on a more positive note, well, I think it is positive and historic that we've been able to, it's not just me, but sort of working with the community, including Wame School. Wame is part of the District 4 Youth and Families Network, or is really the anchor for it. That's a network of community organizations here in the Sunset that we've worked with closely. We've also worked with to create a West Side affordable housing network. So this spans the Sunset and the Richmond District. So it's community groups that are working to build more support for affordable housing development, so we don't see such a negative reaction or a difficult fight to build 2550 Irving. There's a West Side Community Coalition that's also been formed now over the last several years. That's more progressive activists here on the West Side that have come together to try to, again, put forward a new vision for a new future for the Sunset and the West Side, and not just being viewed as this conservative, exclusionary homeowner neighborhood. So I think that, and so working with like, that's been part of what I've done, I think, and I brought my community in labor organizing background into my work as supervisors to build sort of community infrastructure here so that we can, these progressive sort of more forward thinking aspects of our community and our culture can kind of be lifted up more, and the voices and yeah, and sort of the more vocal conservative voices aren't the only ones that are heard or seen in the Sunset District. So and actually one final note too is, you know, I see, like, particularly with the Chinese community here in the Sunset, like it's like the older generation that tends to be the more very traditional conservative folks, you know, like, and even around like cannabis, for example, that's been a big hot button issue in the Sunset, like opposing cannabis shops, right? And there's been big fights, you know, and it's mostly the Chinese community that's opposing it. But finally, the first you know, cannabis shop opened up on Irving and 22nd Avenue, yeah, after a big fight, and now that it's open, you know, the people, and it's mostly older Chinese, conservative Chinese folks, and some of the white folks that opposed it, you know, we can see that the world didn't end, you know, our kids didn't all become heroin addicts, you know, so I think that's gonna be the case with 2550 Irving too, where you know, once it's built, they're gonna, and in fact, the Pipeline, you know, shop on Irving, it's really been a good addition to the Irving commercial corridor, because they have, you know, full-time security there, so it's helped on public safety in the neighborhood. They're very involved in the neighborhood merchant association, so I think that's going to be the same with 2550 Irving. Despite the congestion, once it's built, we'll see that it's a really positive addition, and it's really within the Chinese families that I think is a lot of the base of the conservatism in the Sunset. It's really, again, the older generation, but you can see within the same family, the kids have a different perspective and a different vision for the neighborhood and the city. So that's another thing that you know, I've been trying to support more is you know, the younger people and yeah, perspectives and voice, you know, being heard in the neighborhood. So I think that's going to be so important for moving the Sunset forward. Yeah.
Yes, I lived on 48th Avenue for 23 years before moving